Why was the new arrival working alone in the far corner of the armory? The men had noticed her before the commander did. A figure bent over the massive form of a Barrett rifle, hands moving with methodical precision, almost reverence. She was smaller than the weapon she was assembling, her dark hair pulled back into a strict bun, regulation perfect. But it wasn't her presence that unsettled them. It was the way she touched the rifle. Not like a soldier cleaning a tool, more like a surgeon preparing an instrument that could not, under any circumstance, fail. Commander Thomas Reynolds had seen many specialists pass through his command. He knew confidence. He knew bravado. This woman was neither. The quiet certainty in her movements was something else entirely. And yet, why had she been sent here, now, after 3 of his best men had fallen to a ghost in the mountains? She spoke without turning her head. "Commander Reynolds, I presume." Her voice was calm, professional, without the slightest hint of surprise. "Staff Sergeant Alexandra Morgan, JSOC sent me this morning. I was told to report directly after getting my equipment in order." The commander studied her in silence for a moment. He hadn't requested reinforcements, not like this. And already, she was talking about getting her equipment in order, as though the rifle was as important as the men who would have to depend on it. Maybe it was. He'd buried too many soldiers lately not to wonder. She finally looked up at him, gray eyes sharp and steady. "You have a long-range problem, sir," she said, tapping the rifle's receiver with one knuckle. "I'm your long-range solution." It should have sounded arrogant. Instead, it landed like a fact. Reynolds folded his arms. "How extreme are we talking?" "Effective engagement beyond 2,000 meters, she said simply. He didn't reply at first. That kind of claim bordered on impossible. In combat conditions, even the best snipers struggled past 1,200 meters. At 1,500, chance became as much a factor as skill. And here she was, statting her parameters as if reading them from a checklist. Later, he'd remember how she said it, not as a boast, not as an argument, as a promise. That night, the story of her arrival spread across the base like fire through dry grass. A female sniper, a specialist claiming she could reach beyond the reach of anyone else. Some laughed, some doubted, but most kept stealing glances toward the corner of the armory where she moved with quiet intent, assembling and reassembling, testing and adjusting, until even the doubters grew silent. Reynolds knew the weight of reputation. In their community, skill traveled by word of mouth. And yet, he had never heard of Alexandra Morgan. Not once. That was its own mystery. Specialists like her didn't just appear out of nowhere, unless their work had been buried under layers of classification deeper than most commanders were ever allowed to see. He remembered her words. "This isn't a claim, sir. It's a mission parameter." But there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. In the commander's office, the conversation turned colder. He flipped through the thin service record she'd provided. Too thin. Training at Fort Benning, deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. No commendations, no detailed reports. Vast sections were redacted or marked "need to know." Even with his clearance, he couldn't access her full history. He looked up. "This file tells me where you've been, Sergeant, not what you can do." Morgan didn't blink. "What I can do is best demonstrated in the field, sir." Her answer unsettled him more than if she'd tried to argue. He saw no ego, no attempt to prove herself. Only the same calm, unshakable certainty she had shown while tuning the Barrett. And yet, when she spoke of the sniper who had killed his men, he caught the faintest shadow in her expression. "You're not just dealing with Taliban, Commander. This is a specialist, someone trained to a standard that matches our own." "How do you know?" he asked. Her pause was brief but telling. "Because of the way they shoot, 3 men under 12 seconds at distance. That isn't random fire. That's someone sending a message." Reynolds studied her, but she wouldn't say more. There was history there, buried under layers of silence, but not tonight. The following morning, the base trembled under the rotors of an incoming helicopter. A visitor stepped onto the landing pad, tall, wiry, his close-cropped hair long turned gray, his eyes still sharp as blades. Master Sergeant James Sullivan. His reputation was legend among older generations of operators. A sniper who had survived the Gulf War, Panama, countless operations no one spoke of aloud. Many of the techniques modern sharpshooters used had come from his training, his field work, his near-mythical record. And the first thing he asked when he arrived was, "Where, Morgan?" When she looked up and saw him, the composure she wore like armor cracked for the briefest second. The others didn't notice, but Reynolds did. It was in the tightening around her eyes, the faint shift of breath. Respect, yes, but something else too. "Master Sergeant," she said formally, standing. "At ease, Morgan." His voice carried the weight of shared history. "Still favoring the Barrett, I see." "Best tool for the job," she replied. Reynolds felt the tension shift in the room. There was history between these two, more than teacher and student. A thread neither wanted to pull in front of an audience. And in that silence, he began to wonder. The mission briefing confirmed what Morgan had suspected. The sniper killing American scouts wasn't just a rogue fighter. It was part of something larger, colder, more calculated. Intelligence called it Project Siberia, a Russian training program run by an old Spetsnaz legend named Anton Volkov. Sullivan explained it with the detachment of someone who had carried this knowledge too long. Volkov doesn't just train snipers. He builds psychological weapons. Precision shooters meant not only to kill, but to paralyze, to create the illusion that no distance is safe, no soldier beyond reach. And now, Reynolds realized, his men were nothing but moving targets in Volkov's proving ground. The weight of it pressed down on the room. For Sullivan, it was an old war returned from the shadows. For Morgan, it was something else entirely. Her eyes betrayed her for only a heartbeat, recognition, perhaps, or memory. "You know the name," Sullivan said quietly. "By reputation only," she replied too quickly. He didn't challenge her, but Reynolds saw the truth unspoken between them. Whatever connected Morgan to Volkov went deeper than reputation, and it was going to matter. That night, as the base settled into its uneasy rhythm, Morgan sat alone with her rifle. The Barrett was fully assembled now, customized in ways that went beyond regulation. She ran her fingers over the cool metal, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She thought of the men she had never met, the scouts who had died without warning in the mountains. She thought of the precision of those shots, the kind of precision that only came from years of obsession. And she thought of the shadow of Volkov, a man whose teaching she had studied long before his name was ever spoken aloud in her presence. But above all, she thought of her father. The compass lay hidden beneath her vest, the brass worn smooth by years of her touch. He had given it to her before his last deployment. He had never returned. She told herself she carried it for luck, for memory, for connection. But the truth was simpler. It reminded her of direction, of finding her way when the maps failed. She whispered to the silence, words no one else would ever hear. "I'll make it count." And in the darkness, she closed her eyes, hearing again Sullivan's voice from earlier that day. She isn't just another sniper. She's something else entirely. Whatever this mission would demand, she knew the truth. This wasn't just about enemy fire or Russian programs or buried intelligence. This was about who she was when the silence broke, when the scope steadied, when the world narrowed to one breath, one trigger, one shot. Tomorrow, the mountains would decide if that was enough. Why did Sullivan look at her like that? As though he already knew the answer to a question no one had asked aloud. The commander saw it too. The way Morgan's eyes shifted when the Russian's name was spoken. Volkov. The name tasted like rust and old war. Sullivan had spoken of him with the caution of a man recalling ghosts he'd once fought in the shadows. But when Morgan heard it, her stillness said more than words. She claimed reputation only, but something lived behind her silence. Commander Reynolds didn't press her, not then, but he filed it away, a note for later. For now, the focus was the mission. The sniper wasn't simply killing at range. He was teaching, testing, preparing, and unless they could break the cycle, more of his men would fall before they even knew where the shots came from. Reynolds turned to Sullivan. "What do we do?" The older man's gaze lingered on Morgan. "We use her." The mountains before dawn were silent, but not empty. Morgan and Sullivan moved in near-total darkness, shadows among shadows, their gear blending into the jagged terrain. Each step was measured, deliberate. They spoke little, communicating mostly with glances and hand signals. Hours earlier, Morgan had finished tuning her rifle, the massive Barrett reassembled with precision only she understood. Every adjustment had been for one purpose: eliminating an enemy who believed distance made him untouchable. Now the weapon lay across her chest as she climbed. It was heavy, but she carried it as though it were an extension of her body. Sullivan, older and leaner, carried his own optics gear, his movements efficient from decades of repetition. Neither of them thought of fatigue. They thought of angles, concealment, and the inevitable moment when silence would break. Their destination was a natural depression carved into the ridge line, offering concealment and a view of the valleys below. By the time they arrived, the horizon was softening with the first hints of purple light. Morgan set the Barrett on its mount, every movement careful, unhurried, exact. Sullivan adjusted the spotting scope beside her, scanning ridge after ridge for signs of movement. For long minutes, the only sounds were the faint scrape of metal and the whisper of shifting wind. "Your form's improved," Sullivan said quietly. Morgan didn't look up from her scope. "Better equipment helps." "It's not the equipment." His voice was low, almost fatherly. "It's you. You've developed a system personalized beyond doctrine." Her lips curved, the faintest ghost of a smile. "I had a good teacher." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with memory. Neither of them spoke aloud. Hours later, movement flickered across the far ridge. Sullivan's voice dropped to a whisper, though no one else could hear them. "Northeast, 1700 meters, 2 figures." Morgan found them instantly in her scope, dark silhouettes slipping into position with the precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. One carried a Dragunov, heavily modified. The other watched closely, mimicking every motion. "Training," she whispered. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Volkov's program." They watched in silence as the instructor guided the trainee, demonstrating sightlines, calculating wind with practiced gestures. The positioning was too methodical to be chance. This wasn't Taliban improvisation. This was schooling, Russian schooling. Morgan exhaled slowly, adjusting her scope. "They're aiming for the Western Patrol route. Our team moves through there in 30 minutes. It wasn't just a shot, it was a test. Requesting authorization, Sullivan murmured into the radio. Static, then Reynolds' voice, calm, controlled. "Confirm hostile intent." Sullivan's reply was steady. "Hostile intent confirmed. Two-man sniper element, range 1700, direct line to patrol route." The pause was brief. Then, "Overwatch, you have authorization." Morgan's finger hovered near the trigger. "Primary is the instructor," Sullivan whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat softened, her body aligned perfectly with the rifle. "Sending it," she whispered and pulled. The Barrett thundered. The recoil absorbed into her frame like she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. Through her scope, the instructor crumpled before he knew he was dead. The trainee flinched, panicked, searching for the invisible hand that had ended his mentor. He scrambled for cover, his movements erratic. Most would have let him run. Morgan adjusted, led the target by fractions only she could see. Her breathing didn't change. The second shot cracked through the dawn. The body folded mid-stride, dropping into stillness. 2 shots, 2 kills, in under 7 seconds. Sullivan was the first to speak. Direct hits, both neutralized. His voice carried no surprise, only professional confirmation. Morgan wrote notes in her weatherproof journal. Calm, methodical conditions, wind, humidity. She treated the moment as routine. Sullivan studied her, something like pride in his eyes. Don't downplay it. I've known maybe 3 people who could have made those shots, ever. She finally looked at him. You could have. Once, he admitted softly, a long time ago. His words carried no regret, only the recognition of something passing from one generation to the next. Later, back at base, the intelligence team spread the recovered gear across a table. Modified Dragunov, Russian encryption devices, training documents referencing Project Siberia. But it was the schedule that froze the room. 3 more training events this week, Torres said, her voice tight, and a final qualification in 2 days. Reynolds leaned closer. Final qualification. Morgan's eyes had already found it. It says, primary instructor present. The air shifted. Sullivan's expression hardened. Volkov. Silence followed. If the Russian himself came to supervise, this was more than a test. It was a chance. Reynolds exhaled slowly. If we confirm his presence, we take him. Morgan didn't move, didn't speak. But deep in her chest, something tightened around the compass she carried. Because this wasn't just another mission, not for her. She worked through the night in the armory, disassembling and rebuilding the Barrett into something no factory had designed. Custom harmonics, hand-loaded rounds, a trigger assembly tuned beyond regulation. Sullivan entered quietly, watching her. He set a worn leather case on the table. Brought you something. Inside lay a ballistic calculator, old but updated with modern internals. Built by a NASA engineer, he said. Accounts for barometric gradient variations, the kind of thing that matters beyond 3,000. Morgan's eyes softened as she held it. This is incredible. Consider it a loan, Sullivan said, for a mission that matters. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more weight than words. The briefing the next morning was colder than steel. Reynolds outlined the plan with a steady hand. A decoy convoy, remote-operated vehicles to draw fire, a real supply convoy 30 minutes behind. And one target, a ridge line 3,247 meters away. The room went still. Sullivan said what everyone else was thinking. That would be the longest confirmed shot in history. Reynolds turned to Morgan. Can it be done? Her eyes held his without wavering. Yes, sir, if the conditions hold. No promise, no bravado, just truth. She had carried her father's compass for years, a reminder of direction when nothing else was clear. But now, staring at the maps, she realized something else. This mission wasn't about breaking records. It wasn't even about Volkov. It was about proving to herself what she had always known, that she could make the shot, that she could do what her father never lived to see. That sometimes, the only way forward was through the silence of one breath and one bullet. That night, as she and Sullivan prepared for infiltration, he paused. His voice was low, softer than she had ever heard. Your father would be proud of you, you know. The words stopped her. Her father, the man who had given her the compass before disappearing into the shadows of his final mission, the man whose absence had shaped everything she had become. Sullivan's eyes were steady. He saved my life once. Somalia made a shot nobody thought possible. Before he left, he told me you'd go further than he ever did. Morgan swallowed hard, the compass suddenly heavy against her chest. She didn't answer, she couldn't. Instead, she closed the case on her rifle, lifted it to her shoulder, and whispered to herself words her father would never hear. I'll prove it. And together, she and Sullivan stepped into the night. Why did the night feel heavier than usual? The stars were sharp, the air clear, but Morgan felt the weight pressing down all the same. It wasn't fear. It was focus. The kind of focus that sharpened everything. The scrape of gravel under boots, the faint whistle of wind through broken stone, the steady beat of her own heart reminding her how mortal she really was. They moved without light, without sound, two shadows stitched into the mountainside. The Barrett rested across her back, a burden and a promise all at once. Sullivan carried his pack with quiet endurance, his breathing steady even on the climb. For all his years, he still moved like a man who had learned to make himself invisible. The ridge they sought loomed ahead, a jagged line against the fading moonlight. By the time they reached the natural depression carved into its face, the horizon had begun to pale. Morgan dropped into position, her movements slow, deliberate. She set the Barrett onto its custom mount, feeling the familiar weight settle into place. Sullivan adjusted his spotting scope, aligning it with the valley below. Their preparation spoke louder than words. Hours passed, but they didn't measure time in minutes. They measured it in wind shifts, in changes of temperature, in the subtle ache of muscles forced to remain still. At last Sullivan whispered, "Movement, eastern slope, 3 figures." Morgan's eye found the scope instantly. Through the glass she saw them, dark shapes moving with discipline, not the careless shuffle of insurgents. The lead figure carried himself with authority, each gesture precise, commanding. Sullivan's breath caught, though his voice remained steady. Height and build match could be him. Morgan felt the air leave her lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. Volkov. For years he had been a name whispered in debriefs, a ghost in reports, a teacher of killers. To see him now, alive, walking, real, brought something cold to her chest. The Russian began directing his men, placing them with calculated efficiency. Spotting scopes unfolded, rifles extended on bipods. Every movement told a story. This was a lesson, a final exam for those who wanted to earn his approval. "Range 3247, Sullivan murmured, adjusting his scope. His voice carried reverence for the number, the enormity of it. "This is the shot." Morgan adjusted her rifle, aligning the massive weapon toward the ridge. Her calculations ran silently in her mind. Wind at their position, wind at the target, humidity, temperature, the curvature of the earth itself. Every factor a fraction, every fraction the difference between history and failure. Her heart was steady. Her hands did not shake, but beneath her composure lived something she hadn't admitted aloud. This wasn't just about Volkov. This was about her father. The compass pressed against her chest, warm from her skin. She remembered the way he'd handed it to her, the way he'd smiled like he already knew she would walk the path he couldn't finish. She remembered the silence after his last deployment, the ache of waiting for footsteps that never returned. He had been taken by distance, by the same unseen hand that now trained others to kill at impossible ranges. And now, she was the one behind the scope. History bent in circles. The radio crackled softly. Reynolds's voice came through, controlled and low. "Overwatch, confirmed target." Sullivan's tone was clinical. "Primary subject matches Volkov's profile. Silver hair, facial scar, commanding presence. Confirmed." "Understood," Reynolds said. "Authorization granted if conditions permit. Priority remains intelligence." Morgan tuned the words out as she tuned the rifle in. Conditions, calculations, corrections. Every movement of her hand was deliberate, her breathing aligned with the slow rhythm of the world around her. Sullivan scanned the air, the ground, the smallest movements of dust and vegetation. Wind variable. Wait. She held still, finger poised. The crosshairs settled on the Russian's chest. "Shift steadying," Sullivan whispered. "Northwest 5 knots, hold left 0.4 mil." Morgan's entire world narrowed into a single thread of existence. Her heartbeat slowed. Her mind went quiet. There was only the scope, the breath, and the trigger. "Send it." Her finger pressed the trigger. smooth, unbroken. The Barrett roared. The round leapt into the sky, invisible, its path bending with wind and earth. For 6 long seconds, time itself felt suspended. And then impact. Volkov crumpled, his body folding into the ground before the others even realized what had happened. Confusion tore through his men. Voices shouted. Hands scrambled. But the Russian lay still, his blood dark against the pale rock. "Direct hit," Sullivan said, voice low. "Target neutralized." Morgan didn't breathe. She didn't smile. She only watched, her eyes still on the scope as the ripples of chaos spread across the ridge. The longest shot, the impossible shot, and all she felt was the weight of silence. "Overwatch, this is Sierra Actual," Reynolds' voice cut in. "Confirm high-value target eliminated." Sullivan keyed the mic. "Confirmed. Range 3247, catastrophic trauma, Volkov neutralized." Static filled the pause before Reynolds replied. "Copy that. Extraction team inbound. 20 minutes. Be advised, enemy forces converging." The mountains erupted. Gunfire cracked in the distance, not random but searching, probing. Volkov's trainees weren't scattering, they were hunting. They'd lost their leader, but they weren't broken. They were predators taught by the best, and they knew exactly where to look. Sullivan broke down his optics with methodical speed. "We move now." Morgan dismantled her mount, securing the Barrett into its transport configuration. The echo of her shot was still bouncing off the cliffs as they slipped back into the shadows. The mountains that had protected them now turned hostile. Every ridge was a possible sightline, every boulder a possible hide. The enemy was closing, and they weren't amateurs. This wasn't a victory, it was survival. They moved fast but careful, choosing a route through the eastern ravine, the jagged stone swallowing them whole. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the crack of rifles snapping across the air. One round struck the rocks near Morgan's shoulder, shards of stone peppering her face. "Sniper East Ridge," Sullivan hissed, dragging her into cover. She pressed herself flat, heart pounding, the Barrett heavy in her arms. The range was close, too close for the weapon she carried. Sullivan swung his M110 into place, firing quick, precise bursts toward the ridge. The return fire faltered, then stilled. "Go," he barked. They ran. The wind rose as the storm front moved in, whipping dust through the ravine, dropping visibility to shadows and silhouettes. For once, the weather was their ally. The storm masked their retreat, scattering the hunters' sightlines. After 15 minutes, their comms crackled. "Overwatch, this is Sierra Actual. Extraction team holding at Rally Point Alpha. Heavy enemy movement between your position and theirs." Morgan skidded to a halt, scanning the map in her hand. "Secondary route, through the drainage system. Adds 15 minutes but full concealment." Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Do it." They slipped into the drainage, a twisted channel of stone and mud carved by centuries of water. It narrowed, darkened, forced them to crawl in places, but it kept them hidden. Every scrape, every breath felt amplified in the silence. And then a crack, the unmistakable sound of a high-powered rifle. The round smashed into the wall inches from her head. Morgan froze. Sullivan cursed, "They've flanked us." She tasted grit in her mouth, the stone breaking against her teeth. Direction. "East Ridge, 800 meters, one of the trainees." The Barrett was useless here, too heavy, too slow for this kind of duel. Sullivan adjusted his M110, his breathing slowing as he steadied the rifle. "Cover the extraction," he said. "No," Morgan whispered. Her voice was sharper than she intended. "We move together." "This isn't a negotiation." His voice was command now. "Mission requires confirmation. If one of us doesn't make it, the other does." Another round struck, spraying fragments across them. Morgan's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to stay with him, but doctrine, duty, the mission. She clenched her jaw, eyes burning. 10 minutes, she said. You follow in 10 minutes or I come back for you. He almost smiled at that, a flicker of something human in the storm. Then he turned back to his scope. Go. She ran. The storm swallowed her, the wind carrying the sound of gunfire into the void. By the time she reached the extraction zone, her lungs burned and her muscles trembled. The plateau was small, sheltered, the helicopter blades already thundering as the extraction team signaled her forward. She turned, scanning the ridge. No sign of Sullivan. Her radio crackled. His voice was steady, calm, as if he weren't in the middle of a duel. Multiple hostiles converging northeast. Extraction team reports ready. Proceed. Her chest ached. Negative, I'll cover you. That's an order, Sergeant. Confirm the kill, complete the mission. Static hissed, then silence. The helicopter settled lower, waiting. The team waved frantically. Morgan stood on the edge of the plateau, the compass pressing into her chest like a stone. The decision burned in her veins. Obey the order, or defy it. Stay or leave. It was the kind of decision no one prepared you for in training. The kind that didn't just test skill, but soul. Her father's voice whispered from memory. Find your way when the map runs out. The map was gone. And Morgan had to choose. Why did her boots feel heavier than the rifle on her back? The helicopter roared, its rotors shredding the mountain air, soldiers inside signaling frantically for her to board. The extraction was here. The mission was complete. Volkov was dead. But Morgan didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ridge behind her, on the storm-darkened cliffs where Sullivan's voice had last crackled across the radio. His words still echoed. That's an order, Sergeant. Complete the mission. The compass pressed against her chest, digging into her skin with every heartbeat. Duty said leave. Her soul said stay. A soldier from the extraction team shouted over the noise, Sergeant, we're leaving now. Her hands clenched into fists. She had never disobeyed an order in her life. And yet, in this moment, the map of doctrine had run out. She stepped toward the helicopter, then stopped. Her father's voice whispered in memory, find your way when the map ends. She turned back to the storm. The drainage ravine was a chaos of dust and broken stone when she slipped back into it. The sound of gunfire cracked across the cliffs, sharp and deliberate. Sullivan was still alive, still holding them off. She moved low, fast, her body tuned for stealth even under the weight of the Barrett. The storm clawed at her face, reducing visibility to a blur of shadows and muzzle flashes. At last she saw him, perched behind a fractured boulder, M110 steady, eyes fixed on a ridge where enemy fire sparked in intervals. His movements were calm, controlled. Each shot he sent back was measured, deliberate, buying time with precision. He didn't look surprised to see her drop beside him. You disobeyed an order, he said, voice even. You didn't follow mine either, she shot back. For a moment the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Then he reloaded and fired again. 2 of them, he said. Trained, disciplined, Volkov's best. They'll keep us pinned if we stay. Morgan scanned the ridge. Through the storm she caught glimpses, dark shapes, disciplined movements. They weren't guessing. They were calculating, narrowing angles, reading terrain. Hunters just like she was. Options, she asked. Split them, Sullivan said. Force them to choose. It was a tactic as old as war. Divide the hunters, make them uncertain, turn their advantage into hesitation. But at this range, with this terrain, one mistake meant death. Morgan checked her Barrett, then looked at him. I'll draw them. You relocate, counter. He hesitated. That's not doctrine. It's survival. Their eyes held. In that silence, something passed between them, trust, forged not by rules but by necessity. Sullivan nodded once. Make it count. She slipped into the ravine, moving with the storm as her cover. Each step was measured, each pause calculated to break patterns the enemy could track. She set the Barrett on a ledge, adjusted the scope, and waited. The wind screamed through the valley. Rain began to spit against the stone. Through her scope, she caught movement, one of the trainees shifting for a new angle. His rifle swept the ravine, searching for her. Morgan exhaled slowly. Not yet. She let him search, let him commit, let him believe he was unseen. Then in a breath she squeezed. The Barrett roared, its thunder swallowed by the storm. The figure crumpled, his body jerking violently before sliding down the rocks. One down. The second sniper reacted instantly, shifting position, searching for the shot's origin. His discipline was sharp, no panic, only method. He fired, his round smashing into the stone near her face. She didn't flinch, she adjusted. Before she could fire again, Sullivan's M110 cracked from another angle. The second sniper jerked, his weapon clattering against the rocks before his body went limp. Silence followed, broken only by the storm. Morgan lowered the Barrett, her breath steady, her heart finally pounding now that the moment was over. Sullivan slid down beside her, his face drawn but calm. Two of Volkov's best, gone. Her reply was quiet, not without cost. He studied her, the storm dripping down his weathered face. You've changed the balance, you know. That shot, 3247, it won't just echo here. Word will spread. It always does. Morgan touched the compass beneath her vest, her voice barely above the rain. Then let it spread. The extraction helicopter fought the wind as it returned. The team hauled them aboard, mud and storm water streaking their faces. Reynolds' voice came through the headset the moment they lifted. Overwatch status. Sullivan answered. Primary target eliminated, 2 additional hostiles neutralized, both snipers were clear. Reynolds' voice carried something rare, relief. Copy that, get them home. The helicopter cut through the storm, the base's lights flickering faintly in the distance. For the first time since the shot, Morgan let herself breathe. But inside, she wasn't at peace. Back at base, the celebration was muted. No cheers, no laughter, just quiet acknowledgement. Volkov was dead, his program crippled, but the weight of the kill lingered, heavy in the air. Reynolds studied Morgan across the table in the command center. She sat straight-backed, her expression neutral, her eyes betraying nothing. You made history tonight, he said. She shook her head. History doesn't matter, the men we lost do. Her voice cut through the silence. Even Sullivan didn't speak. Reynolds leaned forward. That's not what I meant. What you did no one else could have, and you know it. Morgan's jaw tightened. Then maybe no one else should have. The words landed like stone. Because beneath her precision, beneath the calm execution, lived a truth she couldn't silence. Killing at distance wasn't just skill. It was intimacy. It was knowing wind, air, and breath well enough to place one's soul inside another's death. And at 3,247 meters, that intimacy only grew heavier. Later, alone in her bunk, she pulled the compass from her vest. The brass was warm against her palm, the chain coiled like memory. She thought of her father, of the shot he had once taken to save Sullivan, of the words he'd left behind, "You'll go further than I ever did." She had gone further, further than anyone. But the question pressed in the silence, at what cost? She closed her eyes, the storm outside fading to a whisper. For all the celebration, for all the history, she felt only the weight of distance. The distance between her and the men she'd killed. The distance between her and her father. The distance between who she was and who she had become. And in that distance, dignity didn't speak. It simply endured. Sullivan found her the next morning. He didn't knock, just stepped into the dim room, his weathered face carved with lines deeper than age alone could explain. He sat across from her, silence stretching between them until he finally spoke. You're not asking the right question. She looked up at him, eyes tired but sharp. What question is that? Not whether you could make the shot, you proved that. His voice was calm, steady. The real question is, why did you? Her breath caught, but she held his gaze. Because I had to. Sullivan leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. No, because you chose to, that's the difference. Orders only carry you so far. After that, it's choice. And choice carries weight. Her hand closed around the compass. Then I'll carry it. For a long moment, he studied her. Then he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that no more needed to be said. Because in their world, words weren't the measure of truth. Actions were. That night the base was quiet. The men spoke less about Volkov now, more about the unknowns that still lingered in the mountains. Morgan sat alone again, the Barrett dismantled before her, each piece laid out with surgical care. She adjusted the firing pin, cleaned the barrel, checked every part, not because it needed it, but because it reminded her of control. Her eyes drifted to the compass on the table. She reached out, turned it once, and whispered so softly the walls themselves seemed to lean closer. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And then she went back to work. Why were the younger soldiers suddenly quiet when she entered the mess hall? Morgan noticed it instantly. Forks paused halfway to mouths, conversations dropped to whispers, and eyes, some curious, some wary, followed her as she moved between the tables. The shot had changed something. She had gone from stranger to legend in a single trigger pull. But legend wasn't what she wanted. She set her tray down at an empty corner and began eating in silence. One soldier, barely out of his teens, whispered too loudly to his friend. "That's her, the one who made the 3247. The friend shushed him, but it was too late. Morgan's eyes lifted, met theirs. Not harsh, not angry, just steady. The boys looked away quickly. She returned to her meal, but the taste was ash. Because reputation was a double-edged blade, and sometimes the sharper it cut, the deeper the wound. In the commander's office, Reynolds stared at the intelligence report spread across his desk. The operation had crippled Volkov's program, but new intercepts painted a darker picture. Cells once loosely connected were rallying. Disparate groups were communicating with a discipline that smelled of coordination. And though Volkov was dead, someone else had stepped in. "They're not collapsing," he said aloud, almost to himself. "They're consolidating." Across the desk, Sullivan nodded. Volkov wasn't just an instructor, he was a symbol. Symbols can be replaced, and whoever replaces him will want to prove himself. Reynolds rubbed his temples, which means they'll be hunting. His eyes drifted toward the window, where Morgan moved across the compound, her rifle case slung over one shoulder. The men looked at her differently now, some with awe, others with unease. She wasn't just a soldier anymore, she was a target. That night Morgan found herself unable to sleep. She walked the perimeter instead, the desert wind cool against her face, the stars sharp above. Her compass dangled from her hand, spinning slowly in the breeze. She thought of her father again, how he'd walked alone before his last mission, how he'd carried himself with quiet resolve even when she was too young to understand what it meant. She whispered to the night, to no one. Was it worth it, the distance, the silence, the cost? The stars offered no reply. But in her heart she knew the answer was not simple. Some truths weren't. The next morning, Reynolds called her into the operations center. A new briefing flickered across the projector screen. A convoy ambush. Half a dozen Allied casualties. Survivors reported precision fire, methodical, clinical, designed not just to kill but to cripple morale. And in the recovered equipment, one detail froze the room. A single bullet casing. Modified, customized. The kind of hand load only a sniper with elite training would use. Morgan studied the image, her face unreadable. But inside, she felt the cold bite of recognition. This was Volkov's ghost. This was someone else, someone continuing the lesson. Sullivan spoke the words she already knew. One of the trainees survived, and he's trying to finish what his master started. Morgan's hand closed around the compass at her chest. The weight was unbearable, because she knew what it meant when a student tried to outdo a teacher. It meant the game wasn't over, it had just begun. 2 days later, while the base still processed the intelligence, Morgan found herself back on the range. Not the long-distance range, the close one. She fired round after round at 50 meters, her movements mechanical, almost angry. Each shot punched into the paper with violent precision. Sullivan approached quietly, waiting until she lowered the weapon. "Distance too easy for you now." She didn't look at him. "Sometimes I forget what close feels like." He studied her profile, the tightness in her jaw, the storm in her eyes. "You think this is about distance. It's not." She finally turned toward him, her expression sharp. "Then what is it about?" He took his time before answering. "It's about the weight you carry. Distance doesn't change that. 100 meters, 3,000, it's the same. You breathe, you send it, and you live with it." Her throat tightened, though she forced her voice steady. "You make it sound simple." "It is, that's why it's hard." She turned back to the range, lifted her rifle again, and fired until the magazine was empty. But no matter how perfect her grouping, the silence afterward still felt heavier than the recoil. The following week, the enemy's response came not with bullets but with silence. Patrols reported empty villages where life had bustled days earlier. Supply lines moved through valleys without resistance. The mountains themselves felt abandoned. But Reynolds knew better. They're not gone, they're waiting. Sullivan agreed. They're learning, adapting. Morgan listened in silence, her fingers absently tracing the compass at her chest. Waiting, adapting. Those were the same lessons she had been taught, the same lessons she had now passed back, through her rifle, into the heart of Volkov's program. The silence wasn't peace, it was preparation. One evening, as she cleaned the Barrett under the dim light of the armory, Reynolds entered. He didn't announce himself, didn't posture as commanders sometimes did. He simply stood beside her, watching her hands work with their steady, practiced rhythm. At last he spoke. "Do you regret it?" She didn't look up. "Which part?" "The shot, the record, all of it." Her hands stilled just for a moment before resuming. "Regret isn't the right word." "Then what is?" She lifted her eyes, steady and calm. "Responsibility." He held her gaze, then nodded once. No more was said. Because in the end, he understood. The legend of the shot spread faster than official reports. Soldiers passing through the base carried it like a secret they couldn't hold. A woman sniper, a Barrett .60, over 3,000 meters, the impossible made real. The story reached places Morgan would never see. Villages whispered it with fear. Allies whispered it with awe. Enemies whispered it with fury. And somewhere, in the shadows of another mountain range, a survivor of Volkov's program whispered it with hunger. Morgan didn't know his name yet. She didn't need to. She knew the pattern, the cycle, the student becoming the master. And she knew one day, inevitably, their paths would cross. That night she lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The compass lay open on her chest, its needle steady, pointing north as if mocking her restless soul. She thought of her father again, of Sullivan's words, of Reynolds's question. Regret, responsibility, distance. They circled in her mind like wolves, never settling, never answering. And in that restless silence, she realized something. The shot had not ended anything. It had only begun a new war. Sullivan found her the next morning, as the sun painted the mountains in pale fire. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, set one beside her without a word, and sat on the bench next to her. For a long time they didn't speak. Finally, he asked the question she had avoided since the night of the record. "What did you feel, the moment after you pulled the trigger?" She stared into the horizon, her voice soft. "Nothing." "And now?" Her hand closed over the compass. Her eyes burned with something deeper than tears. Everything. The old sniper nodded, sipping his coffee. He didn't tell her it would get easier, because it wouldn't. He only said, "Then you're still human, and that's what matters." She breathed in the mountain air, the coffee's warmth grounding her. For the first time in days, she let herself believe he was right. But deep down, she also knew. Humanity was both her strength and her burden. And somewhere out there, another sniper was preparing to test just how far she could carry it. Why was the range suddenly empty? Morgan noticed it on a quiet afternoon. Normally, younger soldiers filled the lanes, firing in bursts, competing, laughing too loudly. But now, when she stepped onto the gravel, the range was deserted. Only the echo of distant training drills carried across the compound. She set the Barrett on the bench, the weight of it familiar, grounding. Her hand rested on the compass at her chest. The emptiness around her wasn't chance. It was silence, respect, fear, maybe both. She looked through the scope, adjusted her sight picture, and thought, not of the target downrange, but of the enemy who was almost certainly doing the same thing at that very moment. Volkov's student, the one who had survived, the one trying to step into his shadow. And she wondered if he was asking himself the same question she couldn't shake. How far am I willing to go? In the command center, the latest reports carried a chilling signature. Convoys ambushed with precision fire. Outposts struck from angles that seemed impossible. Each scene left behind not chaos but proof, empty casings hand-loaded, weapons too finely tuned for militia hands. This wasn't random. This was a craftsman at work. Reynolds studied the patterns on the map. He's learning fast, each engagement more disciplined than the last. He's not just continuing Volkov's program, he's refining it. Sullivan leaned closer. His eyes were sharp, but his voice carried something heavier. This isn't training anymore. It's a duel. Morgan stood at the edge of the table, silent, watching the pins creep closer to their sector. Each new report wasn't just intelligence. It was a message. The student wasn't hiding. He was calling her out. That night she sat outside her quarters, the desert wind tugging at her hair. The compass lay open in her palm, the brass glowing faintly in the moonlight. Sullivan joined her without speaking, lowering himself onto the step beside her. For a while, they simply listened to the silence. Finally, she whispered, "He's hunting me." Sullivan didn't deny it. "You made the shot, that makes you the mark." She turned the compass slowly, the needle trembling before settling north. "I didn't ask for this." "No one ever does." His voice was steady, quiet, "but you answer anyway." Her throat tightened. "And if I can't?" "Then you don't come home." He didn't soften the truth. He never had. And in a way, that was the only kindness she trusted. Days later, the enemy made the first move. A forward operating outpost, small, lightly manned, was struck at dawn. 3 men dead before they even realized they were being watched. Survivors swore the shooter never revealed his position. His fire was surgical, his exfiltration perfect. Morgan studied the recovered ballistics in the lab. The rounds were handcrafted, balanced to a level of obsession. She recognized the method instantly. Because it was her own. She set the casing back on the table, her face unreadable. Inside, though, something shifted. This wasn't just an enemy copying Volkov. This was someone mirroring her. And mirrors cut both ways. Reynolds called an emergency briefing. "Intel suggests our shooter has been shadowing our patrols," he said, his hand slicing across the map. "Not just attacking, observing, studying. He wants more than kills, he wants her." His eyes flicked to Morgan. She didn't look away. "Then let him find me." The room fell silent. Sullivan's gaze lingered on her, sharp, questioning. Reynolds exhaled, shaking his head. "We can't afford that risk. You're an asset, Morgan, not bait." But she was already thinking ahead. If the enemy was studying her, Then the only way to end it was to step into his study. She didn't say it aloud, not yet. That evening, she worked in the armory long after the others had left. She stripped the Barrett down to bare steel, cleaned every part until it gleamed, and rebuilt it with hands that moved like memory. Each piece carried weight, each adjustment was deliberate. This wasn't about record shots now, it was about survival. Her father's compass lay on the bench beside her. She touched it once, twice, like a ritual, then slid it back into her vest. And for the first time since the mission against Volkov, she whispered aloud, "I'm ready." The walls didn't answer, but she felt the silence lean closer. Sullivan confronted her the next morning. "You're planning something," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. She didn't deny it. "If he wants me, I'll give him the chance, but on my terms." His eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous kind of pride." "It's not pride," she said softly. "It's inevitability." For a moment his gaze softened. "You remind me of him sometimes, your father." Her chest tightened. "That's not fair." "Neither is war." He let the words hang there, heavy and cruel, before he finally added, "If you're going to do this, you won't do it alone." She didn't thank him, she didn't have to. 2 days later, the plan was in motion. Reynolds authorized a patrol convoy into a contested valley, but this time the real cargo wasn't supplies. It was bait. "Morgan." She rode in silence, the Barrett across her knees, Sullivan beside her. The younger soldiers shifted nervously, stealing glances at her as though she were a talisman and a curse all at once. The convoy rattled down the broken road, mountains rising like teeth on either side. The silence was suffocating. Morgan felt the compass against her chest, its steady weight grounding her. Every sense sharpened. Every instinct screamed that eyes were watching from the ridges above. And then gunfire. A single round cracked, striking the dirt inches from the lead vehicle's tire. A warning, not an ambush. The convoy halted. Silence fell again, louder than the shot. Morgan stepped out of the vehicle, Barrett in hand. The mountains waited. She knew what this was. An invitation. Sullivan's voice rasped in her earpiece. "He's here, watching, waiting for you to move." Her eye swept the ridges. Nothing, no flash, no movement. He was good, too good. Her breath steadied. She lowered to one knee, unfolding the Barrett, setting it on its bipod with slow, deliberate precision. The convoy's soldiers watched, holding their breath. Through the scope the mountains stretched endless and empty. But she knew better. Somewhere out there, another eye was pressed to glass, another breath slowing, another finger poised. A duel not of nations, not of armies. Of two people, each carrying the weight of silence, each shaped by the ghosts of men they had never stopped chasing. The world narrowed to a single moment. Morgan's heart slowed. The compass pressed into her chest like destiny itself. And she whispered to herself, so quietly no one else could hear. Sometimes the only way forward is to face your own reflection. And then at last she saw him. A shadow across the ridge, a scope glint just for a breath before vanishing. The duel had begun. Why did the silence feel louder than the storm that had nearly killed her weeks ago? The convoy sat still, engines idling low, soldiers crouched behind steel and sandbags, their rifles scanning ridgelines they couldn't see. But Morgan knew. The enemy wasn't watching them. He was watching her. Her cheek pressed against the Barrett's stock, her eye locked to the scope. The glass framed the jagged mountains like a stage, shadows shifting with every gust of wind. Nothing moved. No shape betrayed itself. But she felt him. The survivor, Volkov's student, her reflection in another uniform. He was out there, studying, calculating, waiting for the smallest mistake. The duel had begun, long before either of them pulled a trigger. Sullivan's voice rasped softly in her earpiece. "He'll wait you out. He knows you'll blink before he does." Morgan's breathing slowed. Then he doesn't know me. She scanned the ridgeline inch by inch, her scope painting details most eyes would never notice. The way a rock cast too perfect a shadow, the way a thin scrape of dust shifted unnaturally against the wind. Somewhere in that chaos of stone and silence, he lay prone, his rifle steady, his eyes locked to her. It was a mirror game, patience, precision. The first to rush would lose. Minutes bled into hours. The sun climbed higher, heat waves distorting the air. Soldiers shifted restlessly behind her, but Morgan didn't move. She existed in stillness, her body aligned with the rifle, her breath controlled, her heartbeat measured. Sullivan crouched nearby, his spotting scope sweeping the ridges. He spoke in low tones, not to break her focus but to anchor it. "He's trained, same discipline you carry, same doctrine, that's why this matters. You're not fighting a man, you're fighting yourself." She didn't reply, her silence was answer enough. Because she knew he was right. At last a flicker, barely visible, a shimmer of glass catching the sun for a fraction of a second. Her scope found it instantly, a rifle's optic, the enemy. But no shot came. He was testing her, showing just enough, pulling back, daring her to commit. She didn't. She held steady, her crosshairs hovering over empty stone, waiting. The duel wasn't about speed. It was about who understood silence better. Time stretched thin. Sweat trickled down her back, but her hands stayed steady. The compass pressed cold against her chest, its weight reminding her of why she was here. She thought of her father, of the silence after his last mission, of Sullivan's words, "Orders carry you only so far. After that, it's choice." This wasn't an order, this was a choice. And she knew the man across the ridge carried his own ghosts. A master lost, a program shattered, a need to prove himself against the only opponent worthy of the duel. It wasn't personal, and yet it was. Because sometimes, war wasn't fought by armies. It was fought by two people who understood each other too well. Suddenly, movement. A silhouette, faint against the ridge, shifting just enough for her to read it. The survivor was repositioning, crawling with slow precision to a new angle. She adjusted her scope, tracking the motion, her breath steady. Then a crack split the air. The stone inches from her face exploded, shards slicing across her cheek. He had fired first. The soldiers behind her shouted, ducking for cover. Sullivan barked coordinates, his voice sharp, but Morgan barely heard him. Her eye never left the scope. The enemy had revealed himself. The duel was no longer patience, it was precision. Her crosshairs found him, a dark shape pressed against stone, his rifle already adjusting for a second shot. She aligned her aim, adjusted for wind, corrected for heat waves. Her breathing slowed to nothing. The compass dug into her chest, direction even when the map ends. Her finger tightened. Another crack. His second round screamed across the valley, striking the dirt near the convoy. Soldiers cursed, ducked, returned fire blindly. Morgan didn't flinch, she exhaled. And she sent it. The Barrett thundered, the recoil driving deep into her shoulder. Through the scope she saw the impact, his body jerked, his rifle snapping sideways, dust exploding around him. But he didn't fall. He rolled fast, dragging himself behind cover, leaving only blood smeared against the rock. She had hit him but not ended him. The duel wasn't finished. Sullivan's voice cut through her headset. "Solid strike, right shoulder, he's wounded but mobile, he'll try to reposition, stay sharp." Morgan reloaded, the motion instinctive, smooth. Her eyes scanned the ridge, searching for the next sign. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Now it was desperation's silence. Because the student had learned the same truth she had, that survival depended not just on patience, but on will. And wounded or not, he would not give up until one of them lay still in the dirt. Hours passed again, the sun sinking low, shadows stretching across the valley. The convoy remained frozen, engines quiet, soldiers tense. The duel consumed everything. Morgan stayed steady, her eye never leaving the scope, her body refusing fatigue. At last movement. The enemy crawled from cover, dragging his wounded arm, rifle still clutched tight. His face was pale, streaked with blood, but his eyes burned through the glass, locked directly into hers. For a heartbeat, it felt less like aiming and more like looking into a mirror. She saw herself in him, the same discipline, the same silence, the same ghosts. And in that moment, she understood the cruelest truth of war. Sometimes the enemy isn't the opposite of who you are. Sometimes the enemy is who you might have been. She steadied her breath. Her crosshairs settled on his chest, then lifted slightly to his head. He adjusted his rifle too, despite the wound, aligning his scope with her. Two shooters, staring at each other across 3,000 meters of silence. One would live, one would not. The compass pressed against her heart. Her father's voice whispered in memory, "You'll go further than I ever did." She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, then opened them again, steady, unflinching. And she sent it. The Barrett roared one final time, its thunder echoing across the mountains. Through the scope, she saw the round find him clean, sharp, final. His body fell still. The duel was over. The valley exhaled. The soldiers behind her broke into shouts, relief, awe, disbelief. Sullivan lowered his scope slowly, his weathered face unreadable. Morgan remained prone, her eyes still against the glass, staring at the body across the ridge. She didn't smile, she didn't speak. Her breath came slow, heavy, like someone surfacing from deep water. Because victory wasn't what she felt. It was loss. The loss of the reflection she had just erased. That night back at base, she sat alone in the armory again. The Barrett lay disassembled across the table, its pieces gleaming in the dim light. The compass rested beside it, steady, patient. She turned it once in her hand, the needle trembling before it found north. And she whispered, not to the walls, not to Sullivan, not even to her father's memory, but to the man across the ridge who would never rise again. "You could have been me, I could have been you." Her hand closed around the compass, her voice breaking just enough to feel human. "But this is who I am." And in the silence that followed, the only sound was the click of steel as she began to rebuild the rifle piece by piece. Because in her world, dignity didn't celebrate. It endured. Why did the air feel heavier when the war quieted down? Weeks passed and the mountains grew silent again. Convoys moved without ambush. Patrols returned intact. The enemy's coordination fractured, its discipline slipping back into chaos. The duel had ended more than one life. It had broken momentum. But silence wasn't peace, not really. Morgan walked the compound in the mornings, her rifle slung across her back, her eyes steady but distant. Soldiers still stared as she passed, some with respect, some with unease, some with the kind of reverence reserved for myths, not people. And each time she wished they wouldn't. Because they didn't see the truth. They saw a record, a number, 3247. But Morgan saw faces, men who had trained, believed, fought. Men she had ended with the stillness of her breath and the weight of her finger. She didn't regret the shots, but she carried them. Every single one. Commander Reynolds called her into his office one evening. The desert light spilled through the window, painting the maps on his desk in gold and shadow. "You're being rotated home," he said without preamble. She didn't answer at first, only stood there, her posture sharp, her expression unreadable. Finally she asked, "Is that an order or a courtesy?" His eyes met hers, softer than she expected. "Both." She nodded once. "When?" "Tomorrow." The word hung heavy. She had lived so long in the silence of the mountains that the thought of leaving them felt foreign. But orders were orders, And sometimes leaving wasn't abandonment, it was survival. That night, she went to the armory one last time. The Barrett lay across the bench, every piece cleaned, every adjustment perfect. She didn't need to touch it, but she did anyway, her hands moving with the reverence of someone saying goodbye. Sullivan entered quietly, as he always did, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down beside her without a word. For a while they sat in silence. Finally she asked, "Did I do the right thing?" He took his time before answering. "There are no right things, only necessary ones." Her hand closed over the compass at her chest. Then what was necessary? His gaze lingered on her, sharp and soft all at once. "That you lived, that you made it back." She exhaled, the weight of his words both comfort and burden. Because survival was never simple. The flight home was long, the drone of the aircraft steady and endless. Morgan sat near the back, her rifle case strapped beside her, the compass in her hand. Soldiers slept around her, their heads lolling, their bodies exhausted. But she stayed awake, her eyes on the darkness beyond the window. She thought of the mountains, of the storm, of Sullivan's voice guiding her through silence. She thought of Volkov, of his student, of the way their eyes had locked through glass as if mirrors could bleed. And she thought of her father. His voice was faint now, but still there, buried in memory. "You'll go further than I ever did." She had. But she wondered if he would have been proud, or if he would have simply placed a hand on her shoulder, silent, the way Sullivan did. Because pride wasn't the right word, not in their world. The right word was endurance. Home wasn't how she remembered it. The streets were crowded, the colors brighter, the voices louder. She moved through it all with the stillness of someone who had lived too long in silence. People asked questions, family, friends, strangers. What was it like? Did you really? Was it hard? She never answered. Not because she didn't know, but because the truth wasn't something words could carry. The truth was in the compass she still wore. The truth was in the silence between each breath. The truth was in the way she woke at night, her hand instinctively reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Some things couldn't be told, only lived. Months passed. She rarely spoke of her service, never of the shot. But one evening, walking along the edge of a quiet field, she stopped. The sky was painted in the fading colors of dusk, the air heavy with the smell of earth. She pulled the compass from her chest, held it in her palm, and turned it slowly. The needle found north, steady, unyielding. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I found my way, Dad." The wind carried her words into the stillness. No answer came, but she didn't need one. Because some things weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to be carried. Back in the city, rumors of her shot continued to ripple. Military circles whispered her name with awe. Civilians passed stories that twisted into myth. Some called her the greatest sniper alive. Others doubted she even existed. She ignored them all. Because she knew the truth. The shot wasn't about distance. It wasn't about records. It wasn't even about Volkov or his student. It was about choice. About standing in the silence, finding her way when the map ended, and carrying the weight of what came after. And that was something no story could ever capture. One evening she sat in a small diner, coffee cooling in front of her. A young man at the counter leaned toward a friend, whispering, "You hear about her. The woman with the Barrett, 3,200 meters. Impossible." His friend shook his head. "Myth, nobody can do that." Morgan sipped her coffee, her face unreadable. She didn't correct them, didn't confirm. She only listened, silent, steady, her compass warm against her chest. Because dignity didn't speak. It endured. Later, walking home under the stars, she paused at a quiet street corner. The world was loud again, filled with the noise of lives untouched by war. And yet in her silence, she felt something like peace. Not because the ghosts were gone, but because she had learned to live with them. She touched the compass one last time that night, her voice soft as breath. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And she kept walking, steady, quiet, her path her own.